A woman CEO denied a first-class meal, then instantly fires the entire flight crew after landing. Clara Mitchell was not an ordinary woman. She was a CEO of a fast-growing tech company, and she carried herself with a quiet confidence that made people take notice. Everyone who met her knew that she was someone who demanded excellence not only from herself but from everyone around her. Her days were usually packed with meetings, presentations, and decisions that could affect hundreds of people, but she had learned to handle pressure with grace. Still, even someone like Clara needed moments of rest, and for her, flying first class was one of those rare escapes. On this particular day, Clara was heading across the country for an important board meeting. She had booked her flight weeks ago and had made every request in advance, including a special gourmet meal she liked. To her, this wasn't just about food, it was about being treated with the respect that every customer deserves, especially when paying for a premium experience. She arrived at the airport early, breezing through check-in and security, her mind already reviewing the notes for her meeting. Everything seemed to be going perfectly, and she allowed herself a small smile as she walked toward the gate. Once on board, Clara settled into her first-class seat, adjusting her laptop, notebook, and personal items. She noticed immediately the usual luxuries: soft blankets, large leather seats, and ample legroom, but her attention quickly shifted to the service. The flight attendants greeted her politely, but there was a hint of detachment in their smiles, as if they were merely going through the motions. Clara had experienced impeccable service many times before, and she could tell when something was slightly off. After takeoff, she asked about her requested meal. The attendant paused, then said, "I'm sorry, ma'am, but that option isn't available today." Clara blinked in surprise. She had confirmed this meal well in advance. She could have let it go, she could have accepted a different option, but something inside her stirred. It wasn't just the missing meal, it was the carelessness and the lack of attention to detail. For a woman who built her empire on precision, this small oversight felt like a personal affront. Clara leaned back in her seat and observed the crew quietly. She noticed small things that others might overlook: a drink being poured incorrectly, a blanket dropped on the floor and left there for a few moments, a passenger asking a question only to receive a distracted answer. Each little mistake seemed minor on its own, but together, they painted a picture of inefficiency and inattentiveness. Clara had always believed that small details mattered, that the way someone handled tiny responsibilities often revealed their true character. She scribbled a few notes in her notebook, not as a complaint yet, but as an objective record of what was happening. As the flight progressed, Clara tried to distract herself by reviewing her agenda for the upcoming meeting. But her mind kept drifting back to the service she was receiving. She wondered whether this was a result of a bad day, lack of training, or simply a lack of respect for her position as a first-class passenger. She could have raised her voice, demanded immediate attention, or even stormed off, but that wasn't Clara's way. She believed in measured, strategic action, and she knew that how she handled the situation would define its outcome. Across the aisle, a fellow business traveler noticed Clara's focus and nodded politely. "Rough flight?" he asked. Clara gave a slight smile and said, "It's fine. But there's room for improvement." The man chuckled, and Clara allowed herself a brief moment of levity. Even in frustration, she maintained her composure, because she understood that losing her temper wouldn't solve anything. As the hours passed, Clara continued to watch and take notes. She was not only analyzing the crew's mistakes but also their attitudes. Some attendants seemed rushed, others indifferent, and a few genuinely unaware of the details they were missing. Clara realized that this was more than a single failure, it was a pattern, a demonstration of how the airline allowed mediocrity to creep into its most important service area. Her sense of justice, honed over years of leading a company, could not let this slide. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, Clara had made a quiet decision. She wouldn't confront the attendants in the air, instead, she would wait until landing. Her plan was simple: she would give the airline a clear, concise report of what went wrong and demand accountability. For Clara, it wasn't about revenge, it was about ensuring that standards were respected. The hours dragged on, and Clara continued to document every detail with care. She noticed how the crew interacted with other passengers, how they managed requests, and even small gestures like refilling drinks or arranging pillows. Each observation was stored in her mind like pieces of a puzzle, forming a complete picture of a team that was failing to meet the expectations of those who paid for premium service. Despite the mounting frustration, Clara remained calm and composed. She ate her alternative meal silently, keeping her focus on the bigger picture. This was not a personal battle, it was an exercise in assessment, leadership, and ultimately, accountability. She knew that the moment she landed, her actions could ripple far beyond a single flight, sending a message about the importance of professionalism and attention to detail. As the flight approached its destination, Clara glanced out of the window at the approaching clouds and city lights. She felt a mixture of anticipation and determination. The first part of her journey was nearly over, but the real challenge, the part that would test her leadership in an unusual setting, was just beginning. She straightened her posture, tucked her notebook into her bag, and prepared herself to take decisive action as soon as the plane touched the ground. For Clara Mitchell, every detail mattered, and she knew that this flight was more than just a trip, it was a test. A test not of her abilities, but of the airline's commitment to quality. And Clara had never been the kind of leader to let mediocrity pass unnoticed. The plane had settled into a steady rhythm, gliding smoothly above the clouds, yet Clara Mitchell felt no comfort. Her mind kept replaying the small failures she had witnessed earlier, the misplaced blankets, the distracted smiles, and the absence of the gourmet meal she had requested. It wasn't just about the missing dish, it was about what it represented: a lack of attention to detail, a lack of respect, and a lack of pride in one's work. Clara believed deeply that even the smallest mistakes could snowball into much larger problems, and she had seen this happen countless times in her own company. Across the aisle, a young flight attendant approached, carrying a tray of drinks. Clara watched as she struggled to balance it properly. One cup wobbled dangerously before settling on the tray, and the attendant gave a nervous smile that betrayed her inexperience. Clara's mind quietly catalogued each action, each misstep, as though she were conducting an invisible audit. To her, leadership was about noticing things others ignored, about understanding the patterns that formed when rules were ignored or standards were lowered. She had tried to focus on her work, flipping through notes and reviewing strategies for the upcoming board meeting. Yet, each time she opened her laptop, her thoughts drifted back to the service around her. She began to analyze the crew, not just individually, but as a team. There were moments when they functioned well, such as when one attendant helped a passenger with a blanket, but those moments were overshadowed by repeated lapses. Drinks were offered without checking if passengers wanted refills. Questions were answered without true attention. Requests that should have been fulfilled promptly were delayed or forgotten entirely. Clara's mind worked like a careful investigator, recording each detail with precision. She was not reacting emotionally, not yet. Instead, she was gathering information, observing behaviors, and assessing the situation. She noted the subtle body language, the shoulders slumping, the hurried steps, the forced politeness that lacked genuine warmth. Clara understood people's motivations quickly. She could tell when someone was doing their job because they cared and when someone was merely performing out of obligation. As the flight continued, Clara noticed more issues. A passenger in business class called for assistance and waited longer than was reasonable. Another requested water, and it arrived lukewarm after a noticeable delay. Each lapse seemed minor, but to Clara, they were signs of a broader problem. She thought about how, in her company, even small mistakes could erode trust, ruin reputations, and affect performance. She had always instilled the principle that details matter, always. And seeing the same principle ignored here was a test, albeit an unexpected one, of her patience and observation skills. At one point, Clara discreetly observed how the crew interacted with each other. Some attendants whispered to one another, apparently ignoring passengers, while others tried to cover small mistakes without correcting the underlying issue. To Clara, this was evidence that the team lacked cohesion and clear leadership. She thought about her own company, where every team had defined roles and standards. It struck her that the lack of structure in this flight crew contributed directly to the poor service. She made another note in her mind: this isn't personal. It's systemic. Despite her irritation, Clara remained calm. She knew that anger would not help her achieve the results she wanted. Instead, she focused on maintaining her composure and professionalism, as she always did. She subtly tested the crew by making small requests and noting the response times, the attention to detail, and the willingness to go above and beyond. Each interaction confirmed her growing impression that the flight had fallen short of its promises. At one point, she overheard another passenger, a businessman traveling to a nearby city, quietly complaining about the service. Clara listened carefully without interrupting, using the information to further understand the situation. This confirmed what she already suspected: the failures were not limited to her own experience. They affected multiple passengers, which meant the problem was not an accident, it was part of a pattern. Clara's sense of responsibility kicked in. If this had happened in her company, she would have been expected to act decisively to correct it. Why should this situation be any different? As the hours passed, the tension inside Clara grew not in anger, but in determination. She realized that when the plane landed, she would have a chance to set things right, to hold people accountable, and to demand standards that matched the promises of first-class service. She imagined herself explaining the situation clearly, pointing out every lapse, and insisting on proper consequences. To her, this was not vindictiveness, it was leadership. Clara knew that accountability was essential for growth and improvement. Clara also took a moment to observe how the crew handled unexpected requests. When a passenger asked for an extra pillow, the response was slow and uncoordinated. Another passenger needed assistance adjusting their seat, and the crew seemed unsure of how to proceed. Clara quietly recorded each instance, noting the hesitations and errors. She could see that the crew's training, experience, or motivation, or perhaps all three, were lacking. She thought about how, in her own company, even a small error would result in immediate coaching, feedback, or corrective measures. Why should a paying passenger be treated any differently? During the flight, Clara also reflected on her own journey to becoming a CEO. She thought about the challenges she had faced, the obstacles she had overcome, and the countless decisions that required her to stay calm under pressure. This experience, although frustrating, felt oddly familiar. She recognized the same principles of leadership at play: observation, assessment, documentation, and strategic action. Even in this unusual setting, a commercial airplane, her approach remained the same. By mid-flight, Clara had gathered a detailed mental report. She knew exactly what had gone wrong, how it had affected passengers, and why it was unacceptable. But she also knew the timing was crucial. She would not confront the crew while in the air; doing so could create unnecessary tension or embarrassment. Instead, she resolved to wait until the plane landed, when she could deliver her observations clearly, firmly, and without distraction. Clara understood that the power of timing could make her actions more effective and her message more meaningful. As the plane flew over vast stretches of land, Clara leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes briefly. She allowed herself a small moment of reflection and even amusement. The situation was absurd in its way: a high-powered CEO, thousands of feet above the ground, taking notes on in-flight service. Yet to Clara, every experience was an opportunity to analyze, learn, and act. This flight, frustrating as it was, had become a live case study in leadership, accountability, and human behavior. She opened her eyes and looked around again. The crew moved about the cabin, performing their duties with varying degrees of competence. Clara noted the lack of coordination, the minor mistakes, and the casual attitude toward their responsibilities. To an ordinary passenger, these details might seem trivial. To Clara, they were critical indicators of how standards were maintained or ignored. She realized that her frustration had transformed into resolve. She would ensure that the situation was addressed fully, and that lessons would be learned from it. As the sun began to set outside the window, painting the clouds in shades of orange and pink, Clara felt a sense of anticipation. The journey was not just about reaching the destination, it was about making a difference, even in unexpected circumstances. She reviewed her mental notes one last time, organizing them into a coherent narrative that she could present to the airline once they landed. Each observation had a purpose, each detail mattered, and Clara felt ready. By the time the plane began its descent, Clara Mitchell was fully prepared. Her calm exterior concealed a sharp mind, ready to turn frustration into decisive action. She had spent the flight observing, analyzing, and planning. Now, the moment to act was approaching, and Clara knew exactly what she would do. She was not acting out of anger or pride, but out of a deep commitment to standards, accountability, and excellence principles she held in the boardroom, and now, thousands of feet above the ground, in the cabin of a commercial airplane. The first part of the journey had tested her patience. The second part would test her ability to take action. Clara Mitchell, CEO and relentless observer, was ready. The plane began its slow descent, cutting through the thick layer of clouds, and Clara Mitchell straightened in her seat. After hours of observation, note-taking, and quiet assessment, she felt a mixture of anticipation and determination. The frustrations of the flight had not dulled her composure, instead, they had sharpened her focus. Every lapse in service, every inattentive gesture by the crew, had been catalogued in her mind, forming a clear picture of the problem. She knew exactly what she would do once the plane touched down. As the landing gear deployed with a quiet mechanical hum, Clara reviewed her mental notes one final time. She had already identified the key failures: the missing first-class meal she had specifically requested, delayed service for other passengers, inattentive responses to questions, and a general lack of coordination among the crew. To most passengers, these mistakes might have seemed minor or forgivable, but Clara's mind worked differently. She had built a company where attention to detail was everything, where mistakes, no matter how small, could have far-reaching consequences. This was not about personal pride or anger, it was about standards, accountability, and respect. When the plane touched down smoothly on the tarmac, Clara gathered her belongings, keeping her composure as always. Her leather briefcase was packed neatly, her notes organized, and her posture radiated quiet authority. She could feel the weight of the upcoming conversation pressing on her, yet she remained calm. Clara had faced high-pressure situations before, whether negotiating multi-million-dollar contracts or managing crises in her company. This, she reminded herself, was no different. It simply required clarity, precision, and confidence. As the passengers began to gather their belongings and make their way toward the exit, Clara stayed seated for a moment, observing the crew one last time. She noticed the subtle signs of fatigue, the nervous glances exchanged, and the hurried movements that had characterized the flight. These were all pieces of the puzzle she had been assembling. Clara was a firm believer that leadership required careful observation before taking action. Acting impulsively could undermine authority, acting strategically, however, could ensure accountability and respect for standards. Once the cabin had cleared slightly, Clara approached the flight attendant closest to her seat. She spoke politely, her voice calm but firm. "Excuse me," she began, "I would like to speak with the crew supervisor about the service during this flight." The attendant hesitated, perhaps unsure how to respond, but nodded and led Clara toward the back of the plane where the supervisor was waiting. Clara greeted the supervisor with a professional smile, but her eyes were sharp, alert, and observant. She began by outlining the situation in a composed and methodical way. She mentioned the missing first-class meal she had requested weeks in advance, the delays in service, and the inattentive responses to passengers' questions. She described specific incidents, giving clear examples rather than vague complaints. Her voice was steady, precise, and unyielding, conveying the seriousness of the situation without any hint of personal anger. The supervisor attempted to explain, citing unforeseen circumstances, flight pressures, and minor misunderstandings. Clara listened patiently, her face showing polite interest but her mind analyzing every word. She considered the explanation carefully, weighing it against the evidence she had observed. In her experience, excuses could sometimes be valid, but patterns of failure, when repeated and consistent, indicated systemic issues rather than isolated mistakes. Clara's conclusion was clear: the problem was not a one-time lapse, it was a reflection of how the crew operated under normal circumstances. After a few moments, Clara leaned slightly forward and spoke with quiet authority. "I understand that challenges can arise, but these are exactly the types of failures that compromise service standards. Every detail matters, and this level of service is unacceptable for first-class passengers." Her tone left no room for debate, yet it was not hostile. It was the tone of someone who had observed, assessed, and arrived at a rational decision. The supervisor shifted uncomfortably, realizing the seriousness of Clara's words. He could see that she had taken the time to document and remember every detail. Clara continued, explaining that accountability was essential for improvement and that the crew's performance had been consistently below expectations throughout the flight. Her words were firm but professional, emphasizing the importance of standards, training, and responsibility. At this point, Clara made her decision. She knew that minor coaching or warnings would not suffice. The failures she had observed were too consistent, too widespread, and too serious to ignore. This was not about personal retribution, it was about ensuring that such service standards were corrected for the future. She calmly informed the supervisor that she would be requesting immediate action from the airline's head office regarding the crew. The supervisor tried to respond, but Clara's presence and clarity made further discussion unnecessary. She had spoken with precision, and her expectations were unmistakable. She outlined each failure clearly: the missing gourmet meal, the delayed responses to requests, the inattentiveness to other passengers, and the lack of coordination within the crew. Each point was backed by her careful observations, demonstrating not only the issues but also their cumulative impact on the passenger's experience. Clara then requested contact with the airline's corporate office, providing a detailed account of the situation. She maintained her calm demeanor throughout the call, speaking to the representative with the same clarity and precision she had used on the plane. She described the systemic failures she had witnessed and explained why immediate corrective action was necessary. Clara made it clear that this was not simply a complaint, it was an objective report of repeated failures and insufficient service. As the corporate office began reviewing her report, Clara watched the crew's reactions. Some seemed anxious, others confused, but all were attentive to her presence and words. She remained composed, knowing that her strength was in her professionalism and decisiveness. Clara understood that effective leadership often required making difficult decisions, and she was prepared to follow through with her principles, even if the outcome surprised those involved. After a short wait, the airline confirmed that they would review the situation immediately. Clara had made it clear that she expected accountability, and the staff understood the seriousness of her position. She had acted decisively, thoughtfully, and strategically, turning what could have been a frustrating experience into an opportunity to enforce standards and highlight the importance of responsibility. As Clara gathered her belongings and prepared to exit the plane, she felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The first part of the confrontation had been completed with calm authority. She had observed, assessed, and acted in a professional manner. While the next steps were in the hands of the airline, Clara had ensured that her voice had been heard and that the expectations for accountability and quality had been made crystal clear. Stepping onto the terminal floor, Clara felt the familiar sense of control and clarity that came from handling situations with precision. She knew that leadership required more than authority, it required careful observation, fair assessment, and decisive action when necessary. Today, she had applied those principles outside the boardroom, demonstrating that standards, professionalism, and accountability were not negotiable, no matter the setting. For Clara Mitchell, the descent had not just been a physical landing, it was the moment when observation became action, and when patience turned into determination. The stage was now set for the next phase, where consequences would follow, and lessons would be learned by those responsible for the failures she had witnessed. As Clara Mitchell stepped off the plane and into the terminal, the bright lights and the hum of activity did little to distract her. She had spent the flight observing, assessing, and planning her actions, and now it was time to see those plans through. The corporate office of the airline had already been contacted, and she knew that the crew's response and accountability would be tested immediately. For Clara, this was the moment when preparation met action, a true test of leadership beyond the walls of her office. The flight crew, unaware of the unfolding consequences, was gathering their belongings and chatting quietly among themselves. Some looked tired, others puzzled, and a few seemed nervous. Clara walked with calm determination, her posture confident and her gaze steady. She knew that true authority was not demonstrated by raising one's voice or displaying anger, it was shown through composure, precision, and an unshakable sense of purpose. Every step she took reinforced her presence as someone who expected high standards and accountability. Before the crew could exit the gate area, a call came through to the terminal staff from the airline's head office. Clara had already provided her detailed report, outlining every lapse in service, the missing first-class meal, delayed responses to passengers' requests, inattentive behavior, and a lack of coordination among the team. The airline, understanding the seriousness of the situation, acted swiftly. They requested that the crew remain in place while the matter was addressed. Clara watched silently, noting the subtle shifts in body language, the growing realization that something significant was happening. The airline representatives arrived within minutes, bringing with them authority and documentation. They reviewed Clara's report, acknowledging the thoroughness of her observations and the clarity of her descriptions. The crew members were summoned to a meeting area, and Clara remained nearby, calm but alert. She understood the importance of timing and clarity in leadership, and she knew that every word she had documented would now be reviewed and acted upon. As the meeting began, Clara listened to the airline representatives outline their findings. Each failure she had observed was confirmed through their internal checks and passenger feedback. The pattern was undeniable: the crew had collectively failed to meet the standards promised to first-class passengers. Clara's careful documentation and precise observations had ensured that the evidence was both clear and irrefutable. The airline acknowledged that corrective action was necessary. At this moment, the tension in the room was palpable. The crew members, who had been unaware of the extent of Clara's assessment, began to realize that the situation was serious. Some attempted to explain, citing fatigue or minor misunderstandings, but Clara's report left little room for excuses. Her words had been measured, professional, and objective, demonstrating that the issue was systemic rather than personal. The airline's response was firm: immediate accountability was required. Clara observed quietly as the representatives confirmed the difficult decision: the airline would terminate the employment of the entire flight crew. This action, while extreme, was necessary to uphold the standards that the company promised to its premium passengers. Clara felt no satisfaction in seeing others lose their jobs. Instead, she understood this as the natural consequence of repeated failures and a necessary step to ensure future accountability. Leadership, she reflected, often involved making hard decisions for the greater good. The crew members were stunned. Some appeared shocked, others anxious, and a few struggled to maintain composure. Clara remained calm, standing apart from the emotional reactions, her focus unwavering. She had not acted out of anger or spite, Her actions had been guided by principles of fairness, accountability, and professional standards. She understood that the consequences were serious, but she also knew that they were appropriate given the repeated failures she had documented. During the discussions, Clara provided further clarification when asked. She reiterated her observations, emphasizing the importance of consistent service and attention to detail. She explained how each lapse, though seemingly small on its own, cumulatively created an experience that fell far below the expectations of first-class passengers. Her explanation was concise, factual, and persuasive, demonstrating her ability to communicate clearly under pressure. By the end of the meeting, the decision was final. The airline confirmed the termination of the flight crew and began coordinating next steps to ensure that replacement staff were trained and prepared for future flights. Clara watched the process unfold, recognizing the significance of swift and decisive action. The crew members were escorted from the area, still processing the reality of what had happened, while Clara remained composed, her mission complete. Once the immediate actions were taken, Clara reflected on the situation. She had navigated a delicate scenario with precision, turning frustration and observation into effective action. The experience had reinforced her belief in the importance of standards, accountability, and leadership in every environment, not just within the walls of a company but anywhere responsibility and professionalism were expected. She recognized that her role in this scenario had been unusual, but the principles she applied were the same principles that guided her daily work: observe carefully, assess objectively, act decisively. Passengers who had witnessed some of the exchanges were curious, asking discreet questions and expressing surprise at the speed and decisiveness of the airline's response. Clara, maintaining her composed demeanor, allowed the situation to unfold without comment. She knew that her purpose had been achieved, the failures she had observed would no longer be tolerated, and the airline had taken immediate steps to ensure accountability. As Clara walked toward the exit of the terminal, she felt a quiet sense of resolution. The first part of the journey, observation and assessment, had been completed with care and attention. The second part, the decisive action and enforcement of accountability, had been executed with professionalism and clarity. Clara understood that leadership was not about personal satisfaction but about ensuring that standards were upheld and that lessons were learned from failure. Reflecting on the experience, Clara considered the broader implications. The incident was a reminder that responsibility and accountability were universal principles. They applied in the boardroom, in the classroom, in everyday life, and even at 30,000 feet in the air. Leaders, she believed, had a duty to enforce standards consistently, to take action when necessary, and to do so in a manner that was fair, objective, and effective. Today, she had demonstrated that leadership could extend beyond traditional settings, showing that principles were more important than context. By the time Clara exited the terminal, the plane, the crew, and the passengers were all part of a story that would linger in memory. Her actions had ensured that accountability was enforced, that standards were reinforced, and that a message about professionalism had been delivered. For Clara Mitchell, this was not a triumph of ego but a confirmation of the values she lived by: precision, observation, and decisive action in the service of excellence. Even as she moved through the bustling airport, Clara's mind remained alert. She reflected on the unusual nature of the situation and the clarity it had brought to her understanding of leadership. She realized that opportunities to enforce standards could appear anywhere, and that the ability to act decisively when required was a hallmark of true leadership. The events of the day would remain vivid in her mind, not as a story of conflict or frustration, but as an example of how preparation, observation, and clear action could lead to meaningful results. By the end of the day, Clara had returned to her usual rhythm, yet the lessons of the flight stayed with her. She had turned a frustrating experience into an opportunity to reinforce principles she held dear. The flight crew's failures had been addressed, accountability had been established, and the standards of service had been defended. In her mind, Clara Mitchell knew that leadership was defined not only by decisions made in the boardroom but also by the ability to act decisively and fairly whenever and wherever responsibility demanded it. As Clara Mitchell stepped away from the terminal, she could feel a sense of calm settling over her. The storm of the flight and the tense moments that followed had passed, leaving in their place a clear understanding of what leadership, accountability, and responsibility truly meant. For Clara, the day had been unusual, to say the least. It was not every day that a CEO became directly involved in holding a flight crew accountable. Yet, as she walked through the bustling airport, she reflected on how the experience had reinforced lessons she already lived by: clarity, observation, decisive action, and fairness. News of the incident began to spread quickly. Social media was abuzz with reactions from passengers, airport staff, and curious onlookers who had witnessed fragments of the events. Some criticized Clara for being harsh or extreme, saying it was unusual to see such swift consequences for a flight crew. Others admired her decisiveness and her insistence on professional standards. Clara, however, paid little attention to the chatter. She understood that leadership often attracted opinions, but the core of leadership was not popularity, it was ensuring that principles were upheld and that accountability was maintained wherever necessary. She thought about the crew members she had confronted and how they must have felt. Clara did not take satisfaction in seeing anyone lose their job. She was aware that the consequences were serious, but she also understood that repeated failures, if left unaddressed, could undermine trust, damage reputations, and compromise quality. Her actions had been guided by a sense of fairness, clarity, and duty, rather than ego or anger. Leadership, she reflected, sometimes required making difficult decisions for the greater good, and today had been one of those times. The airline, following Clara's report and immediate actions, began reviewing its training procedures and protocols for first-class service. They recognized the gaps in the crew's performance and committed to implementing changes to prevent similar incidents in the future. Clara felt a quiet sense of satisfaction knowing that her intervention had prompted real, constructive change. She had turned a frustrating experience into an opportunity for improvement, not just for herself, but for every passenger who would fly with that airline in the future. As she made her way through the airport, Clara reflected on the broader meaning of the day's events. It had been more than just a flight gone wrong. It had been a test of her principles, a reminder that standards were universal and that accountability could not be compromised, no matter the setting. She thought about her company and how the same principles applied there: careful observation, attention to detail, fair assessment, and decisive action when standards were not met. Today had reinforced her belief that leadership was not confined to offices or boardrooms. It was a mindset, a commitment to excellence that could manifest anywhere. Clara also considered how the passengers must have perceived the situation. For many, the flight had been frustrating, yet her actions had restored a sense of fairness and reliability. Even though most of the details remained private, the knowledge that someone had noticed, assessed, and acted to correct failures would likely resonate. Clara understood that accountability created trust, and trust was at the heart of all successful relationships, personal, professional, or commercial. The flight crew, meanwhile, was processing the reality of their situation. Some were likely reflecting on the mistakes that had led to the outcome, while others may have felt shocked or unfairly treated. Clara did not concern herself with their emotions. She knew that leadership was not about pleasing everyone. It was about fairness, clarity, and ensuring that principles were upheld. In her mind, the outcome was not personal punishment but a natural consequence of repeated failures that could no longer be ignored. Later, as Clara settled into her hotel room for the night, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. The day had been intense, unusual, and even exhausting, but it had also been deeply instructive. She thought about how every decision she made, whether in her company or in unexpected circumstances like today, shaped outcomes and influenced the behavior of others. Leadership, she realized, was less about authority and more about responsibility, integrity, and consistency. Every action, every observation, and every decision mattered. Clara reviewed her mental notes one last time, thinking about what she had learned from the experience. Observation was critical. Small details often revealed patterns that could otherwise go unnoticed. Assessment had to be objective, fair, and thorough. Action needed to be decisive, timely, and proportionate to the situation. Today had been a real-life test of these principles, and Clara had emerged confident that her approach had been effective. She had acted not out of impulse or frustration but with a clear mind and a strategic plan, turning a challenging situation into a positive outcome. She also recognized that this experience would serve as a story she could share, not as a tale of confrontation, but as an example of leadership in action. It illustrated that standards were universal and that accountability was not optional. It showed that when leaders observed failures, they had a duty to respond thoughtfully, fairly, and decisively. And perhaps most importantly, it reinforced that composure, clarity, and professionalism could guide actions even in unusual or high-pressure situations. The next day, Clara returned to her business schedule, carrying with her the lessons of the previous flight. She met with her team, conducted meetings, and made decisions with her usual clarity and precision. Yet, the memory of the flight lingered, a reminder that leadership could appear in unexpected places, and that standing by one's principles was always the right choice. Passengers who had been on the flight later shared their stories, some online and some in personal conversations. Many mentioned Clara's presence and the swift accountability that followed. While reactions varied, one theme emerged clearly: principled, decisive action leaves a lasting impression. Clara's insistence on standards, fairness, and responsibility had resonated beyond the immediate situation, demonstrating that leadership was about more than authority, it was about integrity in action. By the end of the week, the airline had implemented new training measures and service protocols, ensuring that future first-class passengers would receive the level of care they were promised. Clara took quiet satisfaction in knowing that her actions had contributed to a positive change. She understood that accountability, when enforced fairly and clearly, could transform not only individuals but entire systems. Reflecting on the entire experience, Clara realized that the flight had been an unexpected test of her values. It had challenged her patience, her observation skills, and her ability to act decisively. Yet, she had approached it with the same principles that guided her life and her work: careful observation, objective assessment, clear communication, and decisive action. She had ensured that standards were enforced, accountability was maintained, and lessons were learned without compromising her integrity or professionalism. As the sun set over the city, Clara looked out the hotel window, feeling a quiet sense of fulfillment. The flight had tested her in unexpected ways, yet it had reaffirmed the values she held dear. Standards mattered. Accountability mattered. Leadership mattered. And most importantly, she had demonstrated that acting with fairness, clarity, and decisiveness could create meaningful results, even in situations that seemed far removed from the boardroom. Clara Mitchell knew that this experience, though unusual, had strengthened her understanding of leadership. It was a reminder that excellence could not be compromised, that responsibility demanded action, and that principles guided decisions even in unexpected circumstances. Today had been a test, and she had passed with composure, clarity, and decisive action. With that, Clara allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection, knowing that her influence had extended beyond the flight, beyond the passengers, and beyond the crew. She had upheld the standards she believed in, and in doing so, had left a lasting mark on everyone involved. Leadership, she realized, was not measured by titles or positions alone, it was measured by the courage to act decisively, fairly, and with integrity whenever the situation demanded it. And with that thought, Clara turned her attention to the future, confident that the lessons of the day would guide her in all her endeavors, both in the skies and on the ground.